The story of the storming of the Bastille, July 1789. The summer of 1789 in Paris was suffocating. The heat of July was matched only by the tension brewing within the heart of the French capital. On one hand, the people were being crushed by the weight of crippling taxes, rising bread prices, and a monarchy that seemed increasingly indifferent to their suffering. On the other, the winds of change were stirring. Revolution was in the air, and a sense of anger simmered on the cobblestone streets, building toward a moment that would forever alter the course of history. At the center of this discontent was the Bastille, a fortress-like prison that symbolized everything the people despised about the monarchy: tyranny, oppression, and the arbitrary rule of a king who had been growing more distant by the day. For decades, the Bastille had housed political prisoners, many of whom had been arrested without trial or due process. It was a symbol not only of royal power, but of the injustice that had come to define the rule of Louis XVI. And on this day, the people would demand justice, the prelude to the storm. It had been a week since the Estates General had opened its doors in Versailles, and the Third Estate, made up of the common people and lower clergy, had already declared themselves the National Assembly, the legitimate voice of the people. Louis XVI had ignored their demands for reform, and the people had responded with growing unrest. Rumors began to spread through the streets of Paris that the king was preparing to suppress the growing unrest by force. The French military had been moving into the city, and mercenaries from abroad had been hired to quash the revolution before it could spread further. Tensions were reaching a boiling point, and the people of Paris began to arm themselves. Parisian workers, artisans, and revolutionaries began raiding gun shops and weapon depots to acquire muskets and powder. The most valuable of all was the gunpowder that lay within the fortress of the Bastille, and the people knew they needed to seize it before it was used against them. The day was July 14th, 1789. The streets of Paris were already filled with anxious energy, with crowds beginning to gather at the gates of the Bastille. The prison, located on the eastern edge of the city, loomed large and forbidding. With its towering stone walls and deep dungeons, it had become the focal point of revolutionary fervor. As the sun rose that morning, a sense of unease gripped the hearts of those who would soon take part in one of the most significant events in French history: the gathering of the mob. The call had gone out, and the people responded. Men and women, young and old, poor and disenfranchised, all gathered together in the streets of Paris. They were not soldiers, nor did they wear uniforms, but their rage united them in a common purpose. Jean-Paul Marat, the radical journalist who had been calling for the downfall of the monarchy, had written of the Bastille, urging the people to take action. His words burned like fire in the hearts of the revolutionaries. "Let the blood of tyrants flow," he had written, and the masses took his call to heart. As the crowd swelled, they gathered outside the Bastille's towering gates, and the cries of "Liberté, Égalité, Fraternity" echoed through the streets, growing louder and louder. These were the cries of the revolution, the anthem of a people who had been ignored for too long. They were ready to make their stand. In the early hours of the morning, a handful of French revolutionaries, led by Camille Desmoulins, an impassioned journalist and one of the most fervent advocates of the revolution, gathered in the Palais Royal, rallying the crowds. With a single call to arms, they set off towards the Bastille, determined to take the fortress by force. But the Bastille was not easily taken. It was defended by a small group of royal soldiers, nearly 30 men under the command of Governor Bernardone de Launay. These soldiers were mostly mercenaries and guards who had little loyalty to the crown. They were simply doing their duty, standing between the revolutionaries and the gunpowder they sought. The assault. As the crowd approached the gates, the tension became palpable. The people were angry, frustrated, and desperate, and they were ready to do whatever it took to seize control of the Bastille. With makeshift weapons, pitchforks, axes, and cannons, they began to batter down the gates. The soldiers inside the fortress, unprepared for such an assault, hesitated. The people of Paris were at their doorstep, and they had no intention of backing down. At first, the soldiers fired upon the crowd, but the revolutionaries, fueled by adrenaline and the belief that their actions were just, pressed forward. The cannons, which had been stationed outside the fortress, were turned on the gates, and a series of violent clashes ensued. The Bastille shook with the sound of gunfire and explosions, and the tension in the air was so thick it seemed to crackle. The defenders, seeing the chaos unfolding, eventually realized they were outmatched. They attempted to negotiate, but the mob was relentless. With the sound of a final explosive charge, the gates of the Bastille finally gave way. The people poured into the courtyard, and the battle moved inside. The soldiers, many of them terrified and unsure of what would happen next, surrendered. Governor Delaunay, once a figure of authority and power, was captured by the revolutionaries. The crowd dragged him through the streets, shouting insults, and finally brought him to the Place de la Grève. There, in the midst of the people, Delaunay was executed. His head was severed from his body, and his severed head was paraded through the streets on a pike, a grim trophy for the revolutionaries. The aftermath. By the afternoon of July 14th, the Bastille was under the control of the revolutionaries. The victory was complete, but the symbolic significance was far more profound. The storming of the Bastille was not simply a military victory. It was a declaration to the monarchy, to the nobility, and to the entire world that the people of France had had enough. No longer would they live in fear of the monarchy's arbitrary rule. No longer would they be silenced by the iron grip of the old regime. The fall of the Bastille was a symbolic blow to the very heart of Louis XVI's power. It was the opening salvo of the French Revolution, a battle cry for liberty and equality, and a sign that the French people would no longer tolerate the oppression that had defined their lives for centuries. The French monarchy, once considered untouchable, was now vulnerable, and the king's days on the throne were numbered. For the revolutionaries, the Bastille was a symbol of hope, and they celebrated the victory with fierce joy. They tore down the prison's walls, looted the armory, and began the arduous task of dismantling the physical reminder of the monarchy's might. The storming of the Bastille would later become a symbol of revolutionary zeal, commemorated every year on Bastille Day, a national holiday in France. But for the people who fought that day, it was not just a day of celebration. It was a day of reckoning, a moment when the people took control of their own destiny. And so, the story of the storming of the Bastille lives on, not just as a tale of revolt and bloodshed, but as a reminder that when the people rise together, even the most imposing symbols of power can be brought to their knees. In the end, the storming of the Bastille was more than a military conquest. It was the birth of a new order, the end of an era. The Bastille itself, a fortress of tyranny, was reduced to rubble, but what it represented, unbridled power, was dismantled as well. The event sparked a chain of upheavals, eventually toppling the monarchy and rewriting the fate of France. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons to stay updated with more content. This content has been adapted from the powerful features of Polyspeaks for You, South Africa's leading accessibility software. Learn more at www.polyspeaksforyou.co.za. We invite you to support this meaningful dyslexic initiative, crafted and developed by an individual who personally understands the challenges of dyslexia.